Okay, so I'm just one.
Have it muted. I'll try my word, but and wireless 1 2.
All right, look at Kristen.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Are we hearing it? Good evening. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here for this celebratory evening. My name is Charlie Hale. I'm Sarah Miller McCune, Dean of Social Sciences. And we're going to have, we have the presence of the Chancellor of our university, Henry T. Yang, who has a meeting that he has to go to right after this. And so he's asked to take a moment, break in the music, and to offer a welcome toast to all those gathered. So please join me in giving a hearty round of applause to our Chancellor, Henry.
Good afternoon. I'm just absolutely honored that Dylan and I are just here to be able to join you to welcome all of you as we celebrate the establishment of the Cedric J. Robinson and the Elizabeth J. the P. Robinson Archive and this inaugural conference. We are so pleased to have Elizabeth Robinson with us today and her daughter Najda. The legacy of Professor Cedric Robinson is extraordinary. He was an intellectual, brilliant scholar, visionary, and a beloved mentor. He was a person of tremendous passion whose teaching, research, and engagement inspired and challenged those in our campus community and far beyond. I remember Cedric as a leader and a mentor who was soft-spoken, calm, thoughtful, and kind, and never without a sense of humor. I remember just when it comes to a very complex social political issue, and sometimes take hours to explain. I still don't quite get it, but Cedric just with that little smile, with the humor, I got it. I got it. That's Elizabeth, you know exactly what I mean. That He's a visionary, a person with mile deep in his thinking. So Cedric and Elizabeth influenced generations of students during their respective tenures at the UC Santa Barbara of over 3 decades each, both of you. Through the Robinson Archive, they will continue to inform and influence future scholars and students. So please raise your glass and join me in a toast honoring the Robinsons. Cheers. 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 Elizabeth and Najda, continue in further and strengthening Cedric's and your family's combined legacy and a forever lasting impact.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chancellor, for being here, for making time in your schedule. And now, please get a drink and something to eat and enjoy this amazing music. And the program, the rest of the program will start in about 15, 20 minutes. So again, welcome everyone, and please enjoy.
I'm gonna ask people to, yeah. So you'll cue it up or something. Good evening, everyone. We're gonna get started with the evening's program. So find a seat if you already have one. And I'd like to welcome you to UCSB's Special Research Collections. My name is Kristen Antelman. I'm the University Librarian. And we're going to kick off the program this evening with a short video. So cast your eyes over here, and it will begin shortly. Do you need access to the computer?
When we began Third World News Review several years ago, we believed that we were part of a movement which would bring integrity to American journalism with respect to the Third World.
For me, I think it's a way of saying, maybe first and foremost, I objected. I dissented from whatever the standard line was. It was a radio show to begin with, and it was the idea of several other people.
Peter Shapiro, myself, and Corey Dubin, and Gerard Pigeon, who was then chair of the Black Studies Department, and we sat down and began broadcasting news principally from Africa. And then later on, expanded to the Third World and moved from radio to public access.
Mostly just by watching what's happening. Going online, reading newspapers.
I was looking at several South African newspapers, ranging from a large newspaper like the Mail and the Guardian to black-owned and operated newspapers like the Star.
After a while, you also, because we each have kind of specialized area that we report on, you know what you're talking about. An important thing from my perspective as a journalist is that you don't go to just one source, that you find a number of different ones. If you're using a blog, is the blog sourced? Things like that.
People saying, that's very important what you're doing. Keep it up. That's so.
We appreciate the fact that we stuck with it for so long. It would be really terrific if there was no news for us to report.
So.
We're so honored to host you all here tonight to launch the Archives Unbound conference and also to celebrate the Cedric and Elizabeth Robinson Archive coming to UCSB Library's Special Research Collections. Thank you. Thank you. It's been a journey, and it's been an intellectually fruitful one at every stage as we built the campus partnership over the last year or so. Together with Elizabeth at every step. And that partnership is now in place as the Cedric and Elizabeth Robinson Archive Project. Yes, thank you. And the archive serves as the anchor of that larger project. And Charlie Hale will say more about the larger project in a moment. On behalf of the library, I really want to thank Elizabeth and Najda, wherever you are. Met you earlier. There you are. Good. For entrusting the UCSB Library with their collection. Both Cedric and Elizabeth have had such a significant impact on UCSB, and the archive's broad and deep resources will ensure that their contributions to scholarship and community building are carried forward by future researchers and students. Echoing the Chancellor's words here, I think we did not coordinate in any way. We're on the same page with the vision. And as we talked about the archive with Elizabeth, we were challenged to consider the many aspects of the different ways in which this collection could best realize its potential impact. And the result is that UCSB entered into a shared stewardship collaboration with NYU which means that each institution will play a role in preserving and making the collection available to scholars at each location and as a unified whole through digitization. And yes, which would not have happened without Elizabeth's vision for that collaboration. So I really want to thank Shannon O'Neill, curator for Tammet Wagner Collections at NYU, and Charlotte Priddle, director of NYU Special Collections, both of whom join us here tonight. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Charlie again, the Sage Miller McCune Dean of Social Sciences. Charlie, please.
Thank you, Kristen, and a warm welcome to all of you. We're gathered here to celebrate this momentous gift, the culmination of some 3 years of meetings, organizing, and deliberation. It's been a truly collective process, building on relationships and previous moments of convergence that predate my presence here by years, even decades. So I want to begin by expressing my deep gratitude to all those who have made this day possible. I did not have the opportunity to meet Cedric Robinson, which I deeply regret, especially after reading and talking more with many others about him in preparation for tonight. Even without having known him, his humility, humor, and generosity of spirit come through abundantly. I did engage Black Marxism nearly 2 decades ago, thanks to dialogues and projects with my UT Austin comrades Muno Gordon and João Vargas. Please join me in a shout out to that same João Vargas. Where are you, João? And the World Stage Quartet, a singular compliment to this very special evening. Elizabeth and Najda's decision to make this generous and generative gift would be more than enough to warrant our celebration tonight. It's my job, though, to make clear that the rationale is much larger. I'm pretty sure that what sealed their decision is a vision to forge with the archive as centerpiece, a creative meeting ground of scholarship, activism, and archival practice here at UCSB, all in the spirit of the Black radical tradition. This includes new courses that integrate exploration of the archive, travel support for researchers, both academics and activist intellectuals, speakers, workshops, and conferences on topics that carry on the Robinson's legacy, like the one that's starting tomorrow morning, and a post-custodial archival program. Imagine this: Professor Jaime Alves of Black Studies, working with the Casa Cultural Chontaduro, a collective of Afro-Colombian women in Cali, to support the documentation of their struggles to take back the city and combat anti-Black racism, bringing the digital copies of those documents back to our library. Or Professor May Miller of Global Studies, working in the Black Archives of Amsterdam, to do the same. Our post-custodial archival practice will replace extractivist collection with enduring horizontal relations of collaboration with sister organizations across the African diaspora, expanding the constellation of materials surrounding the Robinson Archive, helping to fortify these organizations by keeping the originals in their rightful home. A second shout out to Professor Chase Hobbs Morgan, who will serve as the inaugural faculty director of this exciting project. Chase? The most meaningful facet of this organizing effort for me, and I'm sure for many others, has been the opportunity to work with Elizabeth. For many decades, Elizabeth you've been a public voice of this university through your work with KCSB, Third World News Review, and so much more. You've been a voice of conscience in the fine tradition of dissent, protest, and insistence that the university live up to our stated values. Successive administrations have at times tended to defer rather than affirm your appointed and principled commitments. And this deferral made you justifiably disinclined at first to consider UCSB as home to your and Cedric's legacy, which of course makes this evening even more momentous. An opportunity to express our gratitude for your generosity, to affirm the vision of radical archival practice that your gift has seeded, and to mark a persistent, gradual, and I hope irreversible process of institutional change. Making the university, at times in spite of itself, more responsive to the people's voices and political aspirations that are too often ignored until it's impossible to do otherwise. As evidence of this pivot, I'm very pleased to report that the Robinson Archive Project has received support from the Office of Chancellor Yang, who you heard from earlier, the Office of the Executive Vice Chancellor, and of course the library has worked very closely with us, with the faculty, as vital partners on the organizing committee from day one, along with the Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts, Diana Berry, who I believe is here tonight, and so many others. I also want to give special thanks to two donors who have, from the very beginning, saw the value of this project and contributed funds to its initiation. Sarah Miller McCune, who's well known to many of you, and Sarah Eisner. They were very excited to be supporters and sorry not to be able to join us tonight. And as Kristen said, a deep note of gratitude to our colleagues at NYU with whom we're collaborating on this project. But I dare not end on a straight-up redemptive note. I respect this wonderful audience and your critical active scholarship way too much for that. Instead, I want to suggest that the Robinson Archive Project embodies the Black radical tradition both in substance and in a less explicit but deeply formative sense in process. It will open an organizing space within, but perhaps not fully of, the university. A space where our efforts will prefigure the utopian horizons to keep us hard at work in good Sisyphusian fashion, even knowing that we're not likely ever to arrive. Thank you. Now, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Robin D.J. Kelley, Nash Professor of American History at UCLA. We all know and admire Professor Kelley's work so extensively that a recitation of his achievements would inevitably fall short in expressing fully that deep admiration. So I'll take a different tack, simply to say, first, as we began to contemplate this celebration months ago, there were many facets that required extended, and I mean extended, deliberation. The selection of the keynote did not. It just had to be Robin Kelley. I wrote the invitation letter, and his affirmative response, literally not more than 1 hour later, spoke volumes. Our celebration plan was launched. His brilliant and deeply personal 2003 Foreword to Black Marxism is the second piece of my introduction. By his own account, that book and the mentorship he received from Cedric beginning in the 1980s shaped his trajectory and helped define his life project. What this foreword conveys most powerfully to me is that in keeping with the highest expression of what it means to be a teacher, Cedric's role as mentor was grounded in love. My third and final piece is to praise Robin's political compass in the spirit of the two individuals whose life work we're celebrating tonight. Whether in his brilliant historical narrative and analysis or his public writing, the Boston Review essay on the movement for Black Lives, his recent post on the UCLA debacle, and so much more, Robin Kelley always brings us back to the what is to be done. We have scholars like Robin and so many others here this evening to acknowledge, thank, and proactively affirm for working so hard to keep our universities from losing their way. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kelley to the podium.
Okay. Let's out the way. Let's see what I got here. I'm gonna take this out, don't mind. Is it okay? There. Okay. That was the nicest thing any administrator ever said to me. I have to say, I mean, ever. And I've been doing this for almost 40 years. So thank you so much. I wish that someone would record that. Okay, so I have a lot of thank yous, some apologies. I can't thank everyone. I know half the people here and people from part of my life going way back. And so I thank you all. I'm not going to name you. I will name three people. I'll name Najda. I'll name Cedric, you know, who I have to thank and continue to thank. But most importantly, I'll name Elizabeth because of a lot of things which I'm going to talk about in this talk. We have been in conversation about these papers for a long time. And I think, you know, Elizabeth's vision is what brought it here. And not only that, but set up a model for archival collection and distribution of knowledge that I think no other institution has actually developed. And so this is, I think, the future. And also, it's like, I'll explain some other things about Elizabeth and how important this is. And secondly, I have to apologize. It is true that it was less than an hour that I responded. I didn't look at my calendar, though. So tomorrow I have to get up at 6, catch a plane to Berkeley, give the keynote address for the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes, fly back that night, come back, and then I'll be here for Saturday. So I won't be here for tomorrow, so I'm sorry about that. Of course, I don't have a talk for tomorrow. If anyone wants to give me one, I appreciate it. I barely have a talk for today because things have been so crazy. All of us have been very busy and worn out because of the political situation, the challenges that we have. I'll say a little bit about UCLA. Most of you know about what's going on at UCLA, but this is everywhere. And by the way, there's an encampment right outside. We'll talk about how we're going to get there after this event. But let me just say, my talk is not polished. It's not sparkling. There'll be no oohs and ahs, you know, no finger snaps. But what you will get is a lot of honesty, some emotion, some critical interventions. So we've all come here together to celebrate Cedric and Elizabeth Robinson's papers, which is, of course, a joyous occasion, but also a sober one. Sober in the sense that the archive represents 2 lifetimes combined of trying to figure out this world in order to intervene, to change it. Theirs is a radical archive that demands something from us, And right now, radical apprehension, radical knowledge, and intervention feels so urgent and yet so profoundly difficult. They both taught us, and we're among thousands, really, who've been taught by Cedric and Elizabeth. And because they taught us, and because we go out into the world, we have to be part of that living archive. In other words, we're all part of the archive as we move into the world, okay? So what I try to do is weave together some thoughts and stories in a way that is more discursive than systematic. I have a lot of stuff that I was going to say in terms of, I'm not going to say it, but I had all this stuff I was going to say about like all the attacks on Cedric, the sort of phony attacks about him being anti-Marxist and all that stuff. I decided to spare you. Because I'll start talking about anti-Düring and Engels and all this stuff. You don't want to hear that. But that was actually in my talk. I'm going to skip over it. But what I want to do is talk about these things, weave these stories together, and build on these themes of what is our responsibility, especially in terms of our responsibility as scholars, not just to our students and to the world, but specifically, what's our responsibility to Cedric and Elizabeth and to this archive? And I also want to share some personal insights of what it means really to be part of these archives. I mean, we're all part of these archives. I'm part of it in a particular kind of way, which for me was and still is a grieving process. So this is about grieving, at least for me, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Although it's also about getting my water here, which I think is this one. Yeah. I don't have cooties, so. Oh, only the old people know about that. No, cooties you get in the water. You know that, right? Okay, so let me begin. The campus civil rights groups at the University of California face the problem of any student protest group on that campus, that of survival. Any student group dedicated to political action finds itself subjected to administrative restrictions, censure springing from off-campus sources, and all too frequently, the withdrawal of recognition, if indeed recognition has ever been granted by the administration. Now, these are not my words. These are Cedric's words speaking at the Slate Summer Conference in July 1961 at UC Berkeley. Now, many of us know the context for this address. I know you thought it was me, right? It could be. We know the context for the address. I mean, I've written some about this. Josh Myers, the great biographer of Cedric, has written a lot more. In the space of a few months, just for those of you who don't know the story, Cedric and sociology PhD student Herman Blake and others had tried to bring Malcolm X to speak on campus, but were rebuffed based on the administration's contradictory and made-up rules. Cedric also helped organize a campus protest against the U.S. Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. They were protesting other issues as well, racial discrimination in terms of the employment office there at UC Berkeley. But what Cedric said about UC, of course, could be repeated today, except he would need to add that the administration's version of censure is to, and I'm talking about my campus in particular, send cops to attack and arrest students, charge them with trespassing on the very campuses whose access they pay an arm and a leg for, charge them with conspiracy to commit burglary for trying to occupy a building to draw attention to the university's complicity in genocide, or just allow fascist and Zionist mobs onto campus to attack our students under police protection, And if these fail, just send in the riot police with their so-called less than lethal rubber bullets and flashbang grenades. Our administration not only administrations, not only withdraw recognition, but withhold any obligation to ensure student safety and well-being. The war in Gaza is our Bay of Pigs, as it were. Of course, the deployment of state violence to suppress student protests did not begin after October 7, 2023. Students got attacked for trying to stop wars, invasions, occupations, and brutal repression in Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, East Timor, Dominican Republic, Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Namibia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Chile, Lebanon, Grenada, Panama. I got more. Panama. I know that's your time's up. El Salvador, the Philippines, Haiti, Ferguson, Palestine, Palestine, Palestine. Right? The solidarity encampments everywhere. But especially at UCLA are critical, kind of a critical backdrop to my remarks, along with a couple of other recent events I want to share with you. First, my friend and colleague, our colleague and also Cedric's student, Tiffany Willoughby Hurd, who's here, is an inspiration on GP, right? So by the way, GP is also another thing old people say. You know, I don't know if you know about that, but it's like general principle on GP. But her response to the police as she stood with the students at UCI's encampment inspired much of my talk. We've all seen the clip of her zip-tied and dragged out by the police while being interviewed, right, if you can call it that, where she gives a 1-minute masterclass on the complicity of the university with imperial violence at home and abroad, the immiseration and precarity created by gender and racial capitalism, and the university as a site of struggle. And she says, and I quote, "We cannot have a genocidal foreign policy in a democracy. These young people are going to be the ones that have to pay the price for these horrible decisions. These police officers out here today, that's thousands of students' scholarships, thousands of students that could have been able to go to school and have books and have housing, but instead, our chancellor, who is a very cruel man, decided to send thousands of dollars worth of state funding paid for by the taxpayers into the trash." And by the way, the chancellor at UCI, he was an administrator at USC when I was there, Gilman. Terrible, terrible person. I have to say, he is cruel. He was cruel then. So he became doubly cruel because he got paid more money to go there. More money you make, especially when you're cruel, you become crueler. In any case, asked if she's concerned about jeopardizing her job, and I know it's probably embarrassing for me to quote Tiffany, she's right here, but I just want you to hear this. She replied in a cynical sentence that still brings tears to my eyes, which is, "What job do I have if the students don't have a future?" Right? That's the question. So when she said that, I was immediately thrown back to 2013, to that Critical Ethnic Studies Association meeting. You know, many of us were there, where Cedric's 10-minute talk both anticipated this moment, located it in a longer history, and reminded us of our responsibility as intellectuals. And he said, quote, "We are not possible without, in effect, the encouragement, the urgency, and the requirement that we be here by those who are being trampled on," by which he meant the imprisoned, the underhoused, the underemployed, the undocumented, the people who sacrifice for us and the state sacrifices for capital. These are my words. He warned of the moral catastrophe we face if we succeed in the academy, while those who insisted we be here continue to suffer premature death in the streets or behind bars. And as he put it, and I quote, "What would be the consequences of all of us succeeding and, in effect, the next generation seeing further developments, further expansions of incarceration? We would be eventually under threat ourselves as we are currently." Okay? So again, what job do we have if our students don't have a future? Right? And is there a future at the university? And that's what's on the table right now. These encampments are both about stopping a genocide, but also have put on the table whether or not we're going to have a university in the future, right? Because even before October 7th, we were fighting this battle of fascists basically running our institutions and liberals allowing it to happen, right? Okay, so that's the question. Now, who are our students? Our students are not always in our classrooms or in the encampments. Our students are in Palestine. their universities turned to rubble, many of their lifeless bodies under the rubble in Gaza. Our students are in Haiti. Our students are in Sudan. They're in Congo. They're in South Africa. They're in Kenya. They're in Papua New Guinea. They are everywhere. These are our students, right? That's what Cedric taught us. That's what Third World News Review taught us. That's what Elizabeth taught us. They're all our students, all of them. Which brings me to another recent event, which is also shaping my remarks today, is that on Monday, I just got back from Tunisia. Yeah, I know I'm busy. 24 hours coming back, passing through Istanbul. It's a really big airport, but when you're sitting there for 8 hours, it gets tired after a while. Anyway, so I was in Tunis, got back Monday, where I participated in a conference titled Rhythms of Revolution, which is not about music, just to be clear. Some of the discussion really was about North Africa, but it's about Palestine. And a good deal of the conference was reassessing the so-called Arab Spring. Now, my talk was on Black revolt in occupied territory, by which I meant insurrections in US cities during the 60s and 70s. But I opened my remarks, by expressing my deep ambivalence about being there in Tunisia when the Tunisian state was beating, detaining, and expelling African migrants, fleeing from genocidal war, fleeing from political violence, economic instability, and climate catastrophe, to be left on the border outside of Sfax with no food, water, or housing, and then to be attacked by Libyan forces on one side and those who pushed the other side of the border to be attacked by Algerian forces on the other, right? A nation, Tunisia, where its President Syed, parrots the Great Replacement theory when speaking of so-called crime and violence that Africans are bringing to Tunisia. See, we have to pay attention, So I recall at the height of the so-called Arab Spring, anti-Blackness erased Africa from the popular rebellions of 2011, which is why they weren't calling it the African Spring, since Arabs, in this case, were envisioned, as a modern democratic civilizing force resisting African regression, which is a racial regime. Now, these are catastrophic times for the world. Gaza feels urgent and immediate, but is one of many genocides and catastrophes, which is not to say that we need to debate what's worse. I get tired of people who are like, well, what about Sudan while you're weeping for Palestine? I think we have a right to weep for Palestine, and we can think about Sudan. We don't have to make a choice or talk about people's, what are their motivations, right? Palestine's a little different because unlike other genocides taking place right now, it is being live streamed. It's hard to escape seeing that. And those are our students too, right? In any case, we do have to continue to look at the world as a whole. And again, this is the lesson that the Robinsons taught us. And especially, we have to lift up Black life and death, which too often slips below the radar, which is the Sudan problem. And I've turned lately to the last paragraph of Black Marxism, where he writes that the movements of his times then, quote, have come at a historical moment when substantial numbers of the world's Black peoples are under the threat of physical annihilation or the promise of prolonged and frightening debilitation. Now, I'm not going to read the whole quote. The whole quote is perfect, by the way, but it's, I'm in a room full of friends, so you've all read that quote over and over again. And I'm not going to repeat it, but what I will say, a couple things. Much of what he says can apply, right, to the moment we're in. The appearance of millions of Black refugees facing premature death, joblessness, incarceration, health and housing crises, drug addiction, bringing conditions of what he calls, in his words, near genocidal proportions. Threat of US war on the Third World, not to mention venal political leaders, both in the US, who are Black and brown, and in the Third World. And he goes on to say, and I will quote this part, "It is not the province of one people to be the solution or the problem, but a civilization maddened by its own perverse assumptions and contradictions is loose in the world. A Black radical tradition formed in opposition to that civilization and conscious of itself is one part of the solution. One part of the solution. Whether the other oppositions generated from within Western society and without will mature remains problematical. But for now, we must be as one. Now, I want to be clear about something. I love to trot out that quote to talk about the present, but he wasn't talking about the present. He was talking about his time, and we have to sort of stay there for a minute. I mean, it's a devastatingly familiar set of problems, partly because this has been a set of problems, depending on when you count. You could begin in 1871, you could begin in 1839, you could begin in 1776, you could begin in other words, the last 500 years, although it takes on different forms. But it's the world that he's facing, he's writing about, is a world that was at the beginning of the 1980s. And we conflate these moments, the moment today and the moment of the early 80s, to our peril. And if we conflate them, we'll fail to apprehend what Cedric is confronting, for it is not just the conditions of precarity, violence, and annihilation he's speaking about, but the response, where our movements were, what materials and ideas and legacies they were drawing on. That conjuncture is unique, where nationalism had a particular valence. And by the way, the book is very critical of Black nationalism. People forget that. It also begs the question, that last sentence, who exactly is the we? Right? Who is the we? All Black people? All people? Remember, he was looking at the collapse and splintering of Marxism at the moment. He was just a few years after the split within the African Liberation Movement, within specifically the African Liberation Support Committee, where there's a split between those who were kind of supporting Cabral and those who were saying, we got to maintain a kind of cultural nationalist position that is class versus, of course, it's more complicated than that. So the Robinson Archive gives us some insight, especially on the accumulation of reports from Third World News Review, as you saw from the film clip. And by the way, Jordan Kemp did a brilliant interview with Elizabeth about the origins and history of conjuncture, which is available, and you need to like conjuncture and give them some money. And of course, Elizabeth wrote a great little essay about this in Race and Class, and I'm not going to repeat either, and you saw the clip, but I do want to emphasize that the date is really important, 1980. It offered what Elizabeth humbly described as, quote, a small corrective gloss on what the Pentagon, White House, or State Department proffered for public consumption. It covered events surrounding the Iranian Revolution, the U.S. Dirty Wars, support for right-wing regimes in Latin America, apartheid South Africa, invasion of Grenada, the bombing of Lebanon, the role of Palestinian and Algerian leaders trying to broker the release of Iranian hostages, U.S. meddling in elections in the Philippines, and so forth. But the most important line for me is Elizabeth's brilliant explanation for why it was called Third World. And by the way, Third World is this term that I go around the country using it, and all these young people are like, that's degrading. Third World I think of dirty. Third World is dirty streets and poor people. And I'm like, let's remember what Third World really means. I got to do this whole explanation. Sometimes I draw on Vijay Prashad. But in this case, I'm going to draw on Elizabeth, who says, we do not speak of the global South because we recognize the Third World as a condition, not a place. We recognize that the Third World exists in Los Angeles, Detroit, London, Marseille, and other parts of the First World. Yes. Got more snaps than I thought. But let me just go back to Tunis for a second. So at this conference, the best talk I heard was by a young scholar named Nazreen El-Amin, who is Sudanese and writes on Sudan. And of course, she rejects this tendency to pose Sudan against Palestine as a way to measure suffering, to compare body counts and numbers facing famine, and sort of thing. But the focus of her talk and her work is on the incredible grassroots organizing of the kind of local networks, the networks that actually made the Sudanese revolution in the first place. these people fighting for power have little to do with the Sudanese revolution. They're part of a proxy war. And she talks about, he debunks this idea in Western discourse of a conflict between, power brokers and warlords and all this stuff. But she says, you got to understand the role of the UAE and other, Gulf states in promoting this war. And meanwhile, she tells this beautiful story of these emergency committees, how they offer lessons in horizontal organizing, in real democracy, in the radical implementation of mutual aid, and how they're dying, right, in doing this work. And of course, what Nisreen shared is an expression of the Black radical tradition. And incidentally, near the end of her talk, and I'm not giving away too much, but she broke down. She had lost friends and family. She knew resilience had its limits. And she also understood, as we all do, that we often expect too much of our comrades, too much of ourselves, never allowing time to grieve. She didn't have that time. In that moment, encircled with scholars from all around the world in this kind of darkened room in Tunisia, was her moment. And she started to apologize. I'm like, you can't apologize, It was important for me to see that, to hear her, also to be reminded that when we talk about Sudan, we need to talk about that. We can't just sort of say, look how terrible things are. We need to talk about that because there's lessons. And this is what Cedric was trying to teach us. There are lessons in these struggles about how to organize, how to see the world, who to listen to. Now, let me just quickly turn to my own grief, because being here today, speaking about Cedric and Elizabeth is, like I said, a grieving process, and let me explain. Now, I first met Cedric 40 years ago. Yeah, I know, black don't crack, and I was a graduate student. And in fact, I wrote about this story, but some parts I didn't tell. But of course, I read Black Marxism, that story. But I accosted him literally at the African Studies Association meeting in LA that year at the Hilton. And this was like October of 1984. And I begged him to meet with me. He was very generous. I'm not a student, didn't know me from Adam. He just knew I sent him a letter. I told him I read Black Marxism. And then I followed up with a letter, which I was going to show if I had a slide, that I wrote this letter on November 5th, 1984. Now, what day is that? That's Cedric's birthday. I didn't have a clue. I'm like, isn't that something? I just found, I went back and saw the letter. I was going to prove it to you by showing. And the letter's embarrassing because I'm like, okay, I was a very young undergrad. I finished in 3 years. I was 21 years old, starting graduate school. And so you know how when you're really young and you're trying to be C.L.R. James and you're trying to write like Marx, and then what you do is you fall in love with a thesaurus, and pretty soon you got all these words that don't make any damn sense, but it's fancy. So I wrote this really embarrassing letter, but it was a begging letter. It was like, I've concluded that there's no other person who can be on my committee but you, right? And so that was the beginning. And as I've said consistently for the past 40 years, no intellectual besides my mother and older sister has had a greater impact on me as a scholar, a thinker, and in some ways, even as an activist. And I say that, no other scholar, no other intellectual. And because I was not a student at UCSB, and I never took a class with Cedric, I would take the bus, the van that would come back and forth every once in a while, and sit and meet with him and talk to him. But our interactions were never daily, they were intermittent. I didn't have the kind of close relationship that a lot of his direct students had, partly because I was very shy, still shy, believe it or not, but I was very shy, I didn't want to impose too much. So I would ask my questions, I would get out the way. And so as a result of that, I wasn't that student who was hanging out at the house. And so I didn't really get to know Elizabeth until I knew her before. And we connected many times, but just in passing, really beginning with the conference that Ruth had organized, in I think it was 2010, right? at City College. So, I mean, but I wasn't like hanging out, but it was after Cedric passed in 2016 that I grew very close to Elizabeth. And this was a gift, this was her gift to me. And it's like she could read, of course, you know, she could read minds, right? I don't know if that's a Lebanese thing, but like she knows what you're thinking. I'm just telling you ahead of time. So she was reading my mind, and she helped me grieve by inviting me to come to the house and giving me unfettered and unprecedented access to Cedric's papers. This is very soon after he had passed. And in fact, it just so happens that the day I spent a whole day hanging out happened to be August 16th, which is the day before August 17th, which is August 17th is, as I understand, the wedding anniversary. And so this was 1 day and 1 year before their 50th wedding anniversary. Could you imagine that? Right. I mean, that was amazing. So I don't know how these things happen. Right on his birthday, we hang out on right before the wedding anniversary. But what happened going to see this material was not like visiting an archive at all. Because, you know, those of us who are historians, we work in archives, know what archives are like. And by the way, we know that archives are not scary places. The people who say they're scary don't usually go to archives. So what is the archive? So an archive is where you go and it's freezing cold, right? Sometimes you're by yourself or with other researchers. You're not talking to anyone. You're silent or whispering to the archivist and you want more boxes. You're reading and you're writing notes in isolation. Sometimes you're working as fast as possible because your time is limited and you don't have a budget to make a whole lot of copies. This is back in the days before people had phones. Like, you know, you could take pictures with a phone. We didn't have that. You had to pay 25 cents a photocopy, right? And then you'd be holding your pee until you get through box 14. You know that feeling? It's like, I gotta go, but I gotta finish this box. And that's what it's like. So instead, being at Elizabeth's house, we spent nearly the whole time at the kitchen table going through photo albums, like some of the pictures you saw here. At one point, we did go upstairs to Cedric's study where Elizabeth kind of showed me the drawers and the boxes and papers, and we went through quite a bit together, but the papers were not the focal point. And let me just really emphasize this. I mean, here I am in a dreamland, right? I'm dealing with, I got Cedric's papers like right in front of me, but that wasn't the focal point. It was the conversation. The story she shared about this or that. In other words, it was the very opposite of the customary archival experience. And I recorded most of our conversation, which, I mean, if it's okay with you, I would give to the archive so you could actually hear, because amazing stories. And most of it we're going through photo albums. I mean, like 80% of our time was going through photo albums. And we went through these albums slowly, methodically, page by page, picture by picture. And she shared these incredible stories about their respective childhoods, ancestors, migrations, their life and work together. Elizabeth talked about her Lebanese grandfather who found his way to Tyler, Texas. I guess we're looking for Taylor, Texas, and ended up in Tyler. How her mother and aunts navigated a kind of lily white school in the South. She talked about her brother David, about what it means to be born in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is not a southern backwater, but the site where the nuclear bomb was also being conceived and created. But she also shared the story of how she and Cedric got together, their respective family responses, and of course the really important work they did in the world of social work in juvenile carceral institutions, which you could see immediately, at least in my brain, where their patience, in their openness, in their empathy for survivors and perpetrators of violence, who are sometimes one and the same in terms of the people that they're dealing with, and that caring, that love that is required to work in those spaces plays out in all things they do. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't there before, but I'm saying I know that it shaped it. She talked to me about everything. And you know what? If I were writing the book, which I was actually asked to write the book, but luckily Josh Myers wrote it, and I could have never done it as great as him. But you know, all that stuff that you told me is not the stuff that would go in a book. You know what I'm saying? It's way more important. Because it was about me understanding who Cedric is, me understanding who Cedric is to Elizabeth, and me understanding who I am and what kind of human being I will be, what kind of father I'm going to be, you know, understanding the story of Najda and how she came into life, you know, all that, the most beautiful things. That's gold. I'm sorry, if I discover some kind of document that could, you know, that would reveal everything, it's not worth it compared to this. So that's what that experience meant for me. And she saw I had a million questions that I'd wish to ask him. And that's part of the grieving process too. And I guarantee that anyone exploring these archives, when you do, will feel exactly the same. And it was one of the best days of my life, honestly. Sitting at the dining room table, you know, the patio behind me, kitchen, front. And it was also a complicated day because I was literally working through my own grief and dealing with stuff about my father, you know, as well. So the last thing I want to talk about before I sit down is about what are archives. You know, we tend to think of archives as a state project, and there's some truth to this, you know. Even if every scrap of evidence in an archive derives from ruling class sources, it should be quickly apparent to anyone that we don't have to wring our hands trying to find examples of Black agency, or whatever people call it nowadays. Like when the machinery of repression, subjugation, surveillance, and torture is sufficient evidence, not only to refuse, say, enslavement, for example, but that people make their own history. And I have to say, I get hives when I hear people talking about giving Black people agency, giving the masses agency, finding agency in the archive that denies the subaltern or subjugated population's agency. And I watched a whole new generation of thinkers, a lot of students who are suddenly like afraid of the archives because it is the colonial history, the official story. It silences this and silences that. And it is true. I mean, there is no point, you know, in denying that some things are silenced. But when you encounter the actual archive, it brings forth so many different emotions. The discovery, the humor. I mean, when you actually see what the state thinks, it's really hilarious. You know, it's kind of funny. The fear and fragility of the state. I talked to Damien Sojourner about this as well. It's paranoia in the face of potential rebellion. But at the same time, you know, an archive is a place to grieve. We encounter death in the archives, in official archives, murdered bodies, people reduced to numbers, families separated. Every archive is different, and not all have the same relationship to the people. Contrary to popular belief, official archives, state archives, don't tell a coherent story, even if the materials collected are intended to glorify the ruling classes. State archives are depositories of records that matter at the time, records of enumeration, finance, taxes, surveys and surveillance, correspondence, diplomacy, diaries, etc. Materials are not so carefully screened and curated as we tend to believe. And so I say this because there's a passing line in chapter 6 of Black Marxism, where he writes, the notorial archive of the Mexican city of Puebla de Los Angeles, for example, is filled with the official reaction to mid-16th century runaways. Now the point could be replicated everywhere. You know, what she's saying is that there's so much evidence of people running away, and that's basically the fear of the state. For owners of enslaved people, the government, for example, had no reason to hide the fact of resistance. Like, they didn't have to hide that. Their point was to end it and regulate movement. So evidence of their inability to do so come through the archive. Of course, there's also evidence, especially under direct colonial rule in Africa, that official colonial archives purposely tried to hide rebellion and discontent. And again, Cedric talks about this too, drawing on C.L.R. James and George Padmore, how certain colonial offices in various empires did not succeed since, there's still those main sources of reconstructing anti-colonial rebellion. And I can go on. So I just want to come to a close. Oh, and actually, one last thing to say, which is closure. And that is, what is our responsibility to this archive, to these papers? And I want to be really careful with my words here. Because, as I've always said, not all archives are official archives. Not all archives are state archives. These, in many ways, are revolutionary archives. They're archives of people who are trying, like I said at the beginning of this talk, intervene in the world and change it. Okay, so it has a different project in mind. But, like every archive, it is filled with partial and unfinished and abandoned projects, works in progress, materials that were never supposed to be judged as complete expressions of thought or ideas not fully formed. Like, I write about jazz, and one of the biggest complications is when they reissue box sets, and all the outtakes, all the bad cuts, especially, Charlie Parker drank too much wine, so you can, they will put all that stuff out there. And by the way, Errol Garner sued Columbia Records for putting out stuff that he didn't want to put out. In other words, artists don't have the choice in many ways. He won some of that suit, but some of it he lost. So my point is that we have to be careful in our responsibility to this material. That doesn't mean that we don't work through it, understand it, and even figure out ways to share it with the world, but not assume that these are finished products. And so I say that from experience, because when I started working with Cedric, I was at UCLA, I was a grad student, I was a baby, but I also had a job working with my advisor at the time, Ned Alpers. You know the story, Ned, I was doing African history, and I ended up changing fields for various reasons. But this was 1983, 84. Walter Rodney had just been assassinated in 1980. Pat fled Guyana with his papers. Ned was a friend, dropped all his papers off in his office on the 5th floor of Bunch Hall. I was Ned's student and research assistant, and he says, that box over there has all of Walter Rodney's lectures on the Russian Revolution. What I need you to do is basically put them on a computer, just the days of the floppy disks, which, the worst thing is when you're typing and putting stuff in, and then you try to save it as disk full, and you lost all your stuff. So I was putting these on these floppy disks, and then he said, we'll edit, and because clearly Walter had an idea about a book. He had a handwritten kind of preface that he wrote, and these were like really difficult material. This is like lectures. He didn't have footnotes, and my other job, the biggest job, was going to the library and track down every single footnote. In other words, every single citation. So he quoted all this stuff. I read more Russian history in the English language than I think anyone in this room, even if you're a Russianist. I'm telling you, because in those days, you didn't have a computer that could scan. You had to read the book. Walter didn't put page numbers. He would cite a book, or sometimes just cite the author. So I had to go through all the books by so-and-so to figure out where this quote came from. And but ultimately it took 30 years. But not off and on. That's another story I talk about. So the book did come out, Walter Rodney's Lectures on the Russian Revolution. But one of the things I had regret about, because I wrote a very, very long introduction to the text, and in many ways took up the task for some things that today would be problematic, and may not be problematic in 1971. And I kind of make that point, but still, there are lessons in the positions that he took with respect to Stalinism. And I should say one side note is that I didn't talk to Cedric much about that project. I didn't realize, because he didn't tell me a lot of stuff. I didn't know that when he was at University of Michigan, he brought Walter Rodney there to speak. And I wish he told me that. I do remember him telling me something about the Russian Revolution and pay attention to, he said, read Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution very carefully, all 3 volumes. And he says, read James carefully. But he says, pay attention to the peasantry. pay attention to the peasantry. He didn't say anything about Walter, to me. In any case, I don't have regrets because I think the book is great for what it is. But part of what I wrote this essay later about Walter and Rosa Luxemburg, and one of the arguments I make is that when you look at Walter's life in Guyana, organizing with the Working People's Alliance, his position had changed. There's no way that he would argue what he argued in terms of the defense of Stalinism in 1971, in 1978. And so, in our responsibility to the archive, we have to be responsible to the work and know that everything is not supposed to be genius. Some things are ideas. Some things they're working through. Some things they disagree with just happen to be on the page. No one has time to destroy all the stuff they disagree with. And if they do, they're just such, they have such egos to do that, right? So that's what I'm saying to us as we move forward, to pay attention, be responsible. And with that, I don't really have a conclusion, although I'm not saying all stuff about Marxism. Oh boy, I was kind of harsh there. Okay, I don't have to, but here's my sort of speaking made-up conclusion on the spot. There's two things. One is that in caring for the archive, it means caring for this history. And we do have a responsibility to carry this history forward, but to do so in ways that are always critical, right? Cedric always said, go deep into the work. No surface level stuff, You've got to do the work and you have to do it well. So if anything, the archive is not necessarily something to plumb for material, it's also a directive about what it means to do this work. And when you see Cedric's notes, he took notes. I mean, I would have loved to work on his stuff because he actually had footnotes and to citations. Walter was like, he didn't have time for that, So my point is that that's the lesson. We have to basically follow through and be the scholar that I think Cedric is. We have to be the thinker who's focused, on paying attention to detail that Elizabeth is. We have to do all those things. And we have to have the political will to take unpopular positions and know that we're fighting for a better world. And with that, I want to invite all of you, right, to go and hang out with people in the encampment, support what they're doing, free Palestine, free the world, free the earth. And as Cedric would say, I love you.
Thank you, Robin, for that both intimate and powerful speech. I love the image of all the people of the young people of the world being our students. I think that's an image that's going to stick with us. And to follow on some of your wonderful reflections of your time with Elizabeth, it's now my great pleasure to invite Elizabeth and Najda to say a few words themselves.
Go ahead.
On behalf of my mom and I'd like to welcome you all to this opening event and the conference Archives Unbound. We would like to especially thank the organizers and would like all of the organizers to stand so we may acknowledge them. Many of you will remember having conversations on politics and social issues around the table with us. During those discussions, people didn't always agree, and there was always space for that. My childhood also included participating in protests with my parents, and many a Monday night going to the public access TV station as they recorded Third World News Review. There have been too many times to count when I'd be out with my parents and people would stop them and thank them for their work on Third World News Review, and later my mom on her work with KCSB with No Alibis and other programs. People would comment on how meaningful it was that they were giving a voice to different perspectives than the mainstream media. Needless to say, I learned at an early age the importance of acknowledging, discussing, and taking actions on issues around the world and in our community. Growing up in and around my parents' political life wasn't without its challenges and concerns. I can remember as a teenager my parents getting threatening calls to the point where my parents had to take the phone off the hook overnight. So I also grew up knowing that freedom of speech, standing up politically, was not risk-free. And I would talk to my parents about this. As a young child, I had an insider experience about the importance of being political and the possible danger that could not deter one from politics. My parents tried to reassure me that the likelihood of anything happening to them was small, but that regardless, it was pivotal for them to continue to speak up. My parents' work has been and continues to be important and crucial. I've been witness to positive impacts both their lives' work has had on individuals in the community and academia, as well as the impacts around the community at large and the world at large. My dad always said and felt that his work was the beginning, the jumping off point for further work and research. His legacy is partially through his graduate students and others who have and continue to expand on his work in many different directions. This collection is entitled the Cedric J. Robinson and Elizabeth P. Robinson Collection. I want to take a moment and turn towards my mom's work. My mom's work and political knowledge has shaped her radio career. And through her international radio work, she has mentored and helped give communities an outlet for communication. Her radio show on KCSB, No Alibis, ran for 40 years. That was a space for discussions on important political and social issues, and included countless interviews that allowed other perspectives and expertise to be discussed. My mom had an instrumental impact through my dad's life and his work, as his work did not happen in a vacuum, but was shaped by discussions with my mom and others, as well as what was happening in the world and his research. As a daughter, I have to focus on my mom and dad as more than their work. Their work is one facet of who they are, but they are much more than their work. To me, part of their legacy is who they are, how they cared and continue to care for others, and how they build community. They are role models for others in this. And as Rob and Kelley had said earlier, there's lots of discussions, lots of people coming over, lots of graduate students. And to me, growing up, I thought that was the norm. Our house was always open, there's always people coming. If you're around for Thanksgiving and didn't have a place to go, you had a place to go. As we continue to move forward in a world without my dad, it has meant so much to me that his graduate students not only continue to build upon his work, but that they also continue to remember who he was as a person. To know that memory is alive and well with others means the world to me. In closing, I'd like to read a few lines from the book, Futures of Black Radicalism, edited by Gay, Teresa Johnson, and Alex Lubin, which is a collection of essays imagined as my dad's health declined. This is from the preface that was written by my parents, which reads, quote, "In compiling this collection of essays, the editors and authors invite or insist that we project a tradition, Black radicalism, into the future. It is certainly our intention to celebrate that and to suggest some ways in which we can find inspiration in our histories for our present moment. In the latter, we are confronted daily with police lethality and other abuse, mass incarceration, and a politics of greed. It is difficult to keep feelings of depression and defeat at bay, but our histories perceived in all their dynamism, their resistance and resilience can give us heart and direction, end quote. I want to thank all of you for coming, and we look forward to a rich conference. I now turn this over to my mom.
Yeah, I can't do this. We'll see. I got it. I got it. Thanks, Robin. Before I go any farther, I do want to say that this is kind of a propitious day and we need to celebrate it. Not because anything's been solved, but that some steps have been taken. And so I don't know if any of the students are here who passed a divestment resolution last night. But one personal note was I was the advisor to the first SJP group, Students for Justice in Palestine, in case you don't know who they are, living in a cave somewhere or whatever. And there were 6 of them, and that was 2008. So the first lesson is that it takes time. You will have heard about divesting from South Africa. You will have heard about ethnic studies, and you will be told rightly that a lot of this reflects the work of students. And I agree with that, but I also want to say it reflects all of your work, those of you who are on the other side of that divide, who are mentors and so on. And it pains me to hear that you are disrespected in your classrooms sometime. And we're probably talking about different students, I don't know. But I think we need to remind everyone sometime that you stand at the head of a classroom in real or figurative terms is because you've done something, to know something, to share something with all those people. And if I think of this generation of SJP, I marvel at how, partly because of the COVID interruptions, how green they were, how little they knew about organizing, about processes and so on. And for that reason, I point to all of you who are on the other side of that. So that said, and also to say, if there's ever any justice in the world, not only will Palestine be free, but a lot of other places that we neglect a lot. If we just assume it's about and because of race, then that is such a benighted place to be, and we need to move on. And I mean, I look around at you are my family in this room, and you are from all over the place. There is no or very little racial, what's the word I want? This is what drives me crazy. I lose words. There's no essentialism around race, okay? Cedric told a group once many years ago that if we lined up all of our good guys and all of our bad guys next to each other, any ethnicity, any group, we'd probably have about as many good guys as bad guys, maybe. We don't know. We all have some of them. But many of us here are also social workers or began that way, and we did have to believe that change is possible and necessary and that we have to work at it.
So now I'll go to my 30 minutes. No. As Cedric used to say, I get to invoke him a lot right now. He's in front of one of my sister's paintings right there. But as he would say, I'll be short. Well, actually, I'm always short. I've only gotten shorter since then. One other tiny comment. Many of these pictures were from the international work I did with radio. One of them, a woman, Zara Yacoub from Chad, had a fatwa written against her because she opposed what is called nicely female circumcision, not so nicely genital mutilation. And it's so good to see she's still around. I think she is. So here I go, and it is short. I'm still going to start this way. It is all but impossible to imagine why I'm standing up here, especially as I have to follow Robin and Najda. Really? But Dean Hale, Charlie, called me a major donor a couple of months back. That made our relationship to UCSB and the Tamament at NYU a little more serious. So I thank Charlie and Henry Yang and Dilling, as I see here, and Kristen Antelman for their many efforts to realize this. And it is heroic in terms of cobbling together what they needed in order to do this. So, you know, what seemed a cockamamie idea a little while ago, now with all of you here, seems okey doke. And I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad I'm here. And I have to acknowledge Robin at least once today, because he's the one that really made me think about it. My famous story is that I used to tell Najda, when we were both gone, take what you want and light a match to the rest. And I told Robin that, and he was appalled. He was appalled. You're going to do what? And I say, and I still think there's some value there. But he also introduced me to Shannon O'Neill, who Najda and I have been able to know and love, and who works at the Tamament, which is at the moment at a university that should be ashamed of itself, NYU. But the Tamament is a place for radical thought, and so it's appropriate that it go there. And most of our third world stuff will go there, but it will be digitized in an accessible way and available to anybody that wants it. And there are people like, I'll call Yusuf Belushi out, Al-Belushi, who has already dipped into things like that. So it's happening. It's definitely happening. But there remains for me some big whys hanging out there, still needing to be answered, especially in these fraught times. Why now? Why both of us? What does it matter when a number of people had trouble getting here due to fractious weather? I'll try to answer, though I know it will be inadequate. On the projector or on the screen, you've been looking at a perhaps fanciful version of my family history, a family tree from Lebanon, from, I think, my maternal grandfather's village. Our histories are at once important to us and mundane. Even the form here is impermanent, as are leaves, which are caught by seasons and winds and so on. But we cherish them. We fight over them, lose them as time distances us from them. We forget them. However, if they are so insignificant, if our grander histories are so meager? Why are such colossal efforts made to disappear them, to bury them, to erase them, to forget them? Why are our libraries burned, leaving ashes as the ghosts of our ideas? Why must we be denying the very existence of entire peoples? Did I mention that I am standing on unceded Chumash land? I am. Let me remind you of one not so distant event that is particularly important as scholarship and as journalism are under attack. In the mid-1980s, a rather unremarkable character, and I don't know how to advance the slides, so if there's somebody out there who can do it for me, it's not that important. Oh, here she comes running. Just if you go to the next slide for me. You don't have it? Okie doke again. But the person I want to evoke is a rather unassuming technician who worked at a nuclear facility in the, I think it's the Negev Desert, but in what we think of as, or what we might have thought of as Palestine, but which is in fact now part of Israel, or we are told it is Israel. In any case, this man, Mordecai Vanunu, and if you don't know his name, you can find stuff, but you got to look for it. Vanunu spilled the beans on this facility, nuclear facility at Dimona. And it immediately made the 2 inside pages, and I left them at my house, but they will be in the archive. 2 full pages of the London Times, which was the newspaper of record, we are told, with diagrams of this facility, 5, 6 stories deep. He outed that because Israel was being coy as to whether or not it had nuclear weapons. It was useful to maybe have them and maybe not. And Vanunu put the lie to that by revealing this stuff. And he paid the price for it. He spent, I think, 16 or 17 years in prison and then got out only to be imprisoned again by being at his residence and not being able to see other people. My point here, and I'm trying to shorten my remarks a bit, because I'm sure you all either want to go home or maybe use the facilities. That's another age joke. Anyway, Vanunu left Israel and was captured in Italy some years later. So for some reason, I found that I had made copies of the London Times article, and I asked a librarian friend, who I can out here, hi Gary Polmanar back there, to find it for me, because I'd like to make a fresh copy of it. Mine was wrinkled and tattered and taped together, and he went to look for it, and it wasn't there. There's no record of it. So it seems to have been disappeared from the archive, which maybe not incidentally is owned by Rupert Murdoch or whoever his heirs are these days. But not only is information more accessible to us and more plentiful, but it's more easily erased. It's more easily disappeared. And that's what these places provide us. And it means, as Robin said earlier, you got to work at this stuff. If any of you haven't read Cedric's books, I have better sense than to try to do such things. I read them. I don't write them. But if you look at his books and at some of his students' books, you will find there are as many footnotes as there are pages of text. And that is a challenge. It's not because it's unimportant. It's that if you want to understand, you have to really search for it. And I've probably gone over my time. Somebody was supposed to flash 2 minutes at me or something. What, victory? Well, I think today, the other thing that we have to mention, and I'm going to mention it in a negative way, is that one of our ex-presidents has been convicted of 30 some odd counts of criminal behavior today. And a nod to my sister-in-law, who at one of our dinner tables, one of Cedric's last political interventions, she asked something like, well, Cedric, what do you think about Trump? Are you worried about Trump? And Cedric's response was, and in a halting voice, I'm worried about the American people. And that is our charge this morning. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being my family. Thank you for allowing me to remember him.
Thank you, Najda. Thank you, Elizabeth. So we're going to be returning to music and food and drink in just a moment. I want to pass the mic to someone who's been absolutely central to this whole endeavor, my friend and colleague, Professor of Asian American Studies, Associate Dean and Faculty Equity Advisor, activist scholar extraordinaire, Diane Fujino.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Wow, look at this beautiful audience. I will say just one quick thing about myself, which is that I only accepted this position that he calls Faculty Equity Advisor in DEI work because when you work with Charlie, it is not DEI work. It is the work of something like building the Robinson Archival Project. I will also be quick in closing words, but I want to first say, Robin, I was so deeply moved by what you had to say today. Thank you for walking us through a political analysis that connects Cedric from the 1980s to the things that are happening today. And you always demand of us incisive political analysis and clarity. I've learned so much from you. Thank you. But not just that, you made it so deeply personal in this week that's very meaningful in terms of Cedric's life, right? And also to create a charge to us about what the archives are and what they mean and what our responsibilities are, right? We have a debt of gratitude to Robin for getting Black Marxism reprinted 24 years ago and enabling so many of us, myself included, to then read Cedric's words and come to reread them and think about them and learn from them very deeply. To Najda, really, really beautiful words and moving stories about your parents and recognizing Elizabeth as a formidable intellectual and organizer and activist as well. Elizabeth, you know, my friend, We've been on this journey together, and this is such a momentous occasion. And I also want to say that it's not without a bit of irony that the Robinson Archives are getting institutionalized in this way when, when Cedric was so often stressed the work of fugitivity. And so it is, as Robin has charged us, right? It demands a lot of us to build the Robinson Archival Project as a living archive. And so many of us in this room will be part of that. I invite people in to not just go to the archives and not just access the papers, but to help build the kind of vision for the archives that Charlie laid out. And it's a living archive. It's connected to community. It's connected to really pressing political issues and questions. And it is a responsibility. And it's going to take us working together to make that happen. I wish Cedric was here with us today to witness all of it. It is beautiful standing here looking at everybody. And I know many people in this room are long and friends and family at this table of the Robinsons, and there are newer friends, but anyways, it's a beautiful place. And I wish Cedric was here with us, but then I realized Cedric is here with us, right? Through all of us, through the work that we continue to do, through family, through so many ways. I just want to thank everybody here, thank those who really built out these archives, and to say that this is, right, a beginning of 3 important days. We have a conference happening tomorrow, 8 a.m., people, at Embarcadero Hall. And we have a whole set of brilliant speakers, and there's going to be time for conversation with all of us because we make this together. And I also want to say one last thing, which is that there are also displays that the conference display committee created. They were done, not surprisingly, at Elizabeth's home. I'm sure over food because Aunt Elizabeth is a marvelous cook, because Elizabeth teaches us about the importance of relational ways of working, always. So thank you, everybody, and just so much love and gratitude to Elizabeth and Najda and Cedric. Thank you.
So please let the music begin, and please enjoy, and it's wonderful to have you all here. Thank you so much.